Hey guys, let's have a look at determining the election results of DR and BDR elections in a multi-area OSPF configuration. Now, this is based on one of the quizzes. We can see here that there's two segments, with R3 being the area boundary router, the ABR, and we have to determine, based on the configuration settings we're given, what is the result of the election processes for each segment. So we should probably understand in which order you can influence, or in which order the router ID is determined, and then the election is influenced on each router. So first of all, if you manually set a router ID on each router, it will use that as the router ID. If that's not set, it will then use loopback interfaces, and if that's not set, it'll then use the highest address based on your physically connected interfaces. And I should probably say that if you have multiple loopback interfaces, it will use the highest address of those loopback interfaces. So, as well as that, if you have a priority set manually on the interface that is part of that segment, it is going to use that priority above the router ID. So it doesn't care about the router ID if you have a priority set. Well, it does if it's the same on multiple routers, but the priority is the main thing that you can use to influence an election process. So let's have a look at this one first. And I should probably mention as well that the default priority is 1. So where it says default, you can just imagine a 1 being there instead of default. So on this one, you can see on R3 that the priority on both interfaces, on both segments, is set to 255, which is the maximum priority for OSPF. It's the maximum you can set it to. So this one's going to have quite an influence over both segments. So we can see here that R3 is definitely going to be the DR, because the priority is set to 255, and both R1 and R2 do not have higher priorities than that. R1 has 128, and R2 has the default, which is 1. So we can tell from that that R3 is going to be the DR, and R1 is going to be the BDR. So let's set R3 to the DR for segment A. Now, there's no option to set R1 as a BDR here, so we should probably look at segment B. Now, we can see here that R5 also has a priority of 255 for the interface on this segment. So we have to compare router IDs. Now, there's no router ID manually configured on R5, nor is there a loopback interface configured. So the router ID is going to be the address of this interface here, because it's the highest of all physical interfaces. As you can see, there's serial and fast Ethernet here. So the router ID is going to be 192.168.2.5. Now, let's have a look over here. We can see that on the highest address on this, or the router ID, is going to be 192.168.2.2. Now, which one's higher? Obviously 192.168.2.5, so R5 is going to become the DR for segment B. Now, let's have a look at R4 and R3 and work out which one is going to become the BDR. Now, there's no priority set on this, so automatically we can tell that the priority of this is going to supersede this one, and R3 is going to become the BDR for segment B. Now, I should probably note that these have the same priorities. So obviously, if they have the same priorities, the router ID will influence which one becomes the DR or BDR. And obviously, if they all had the same priority, you would need to check the router ID, and the highest one will become the DR, the second highest one would become the BDR, and the other ones would become DR others. Now, here's another example. So we should probably just run through and do a quick workout. We can see on R3 here, our area boundary router, ABR, that there's priority set on each of the interfaces on each segment. The router ID is 10.1.1.3. Okay, so we can automatically tell on this network here that this one is going to become the DR because it has the highest priority. This one has a priority of 1, and this one on this interface, FA00, has a priority of 100. So R1 is going to become the DR for segment A, and R3 is going to become the BDR for segment A. So can we have an option for that? Yes, we do. We do have an option for that. So let's work out what segment B is like. So we have a few priorities here. this one has a priority of 128, and this one has a priority of 200 on this network, and this one has a priority of 50. So R3 would become the DR for segment B. Is there an option for that? No. So we need to work out of these two, which one would be the BDR. Now, this one has a priority of 128, so we can automatically, or we can just assume, or we know, that R5 is going to become the BDR for segment B. Let's do another example. Alright, so this one's a bit harder because all the priorities are set to 1. So we need to use the router IDs to determine the results of the election process. So the router ID for this one here is going to be 10.1.1.1. On this one, it's going to be 172.16.1.3. And on this one, it's going to be 192.168.2.2. So out of all of these, the one with the highest router ID is going to be 192.168.2.2. So based on this, we can tell that the highest, we can tell that the DR for segment A is going to become R3. Now, what is the BDR, or the backup designator router, for segment A? So the second highest one is going to be between 172.16.1.3 and 10.1.1.1. Now, R2, this address is higher, so R2 is going to become the BDR. There's no option for that, so let's have a look at segment B. Now, the DR for segment B is going to be it's going to be between 172.16.1.4, 172.16.1.5, and 192.168.2.2. So R3 is going to become the DR for segment B. Now, what is going to be the BDR for this? Well, it's going to be 172.16.1.5, which is assigned to R4. Actually, no, it's going to be R5 because R4 has a manually set router ID. So R5 is going to become the BDR for segment B. Now, I should have probably noted that R4 has a router ID manually set. So we have to look at that address and not the other one. Now, let's have a look at this one. What are the BDR and DR elections for this one? It's basically the same thing over again. We have to have a look at router IDs, we have to look at priorities, and then if there are no router IDs set, we need to look at loopbacks first, and then the highest address based on any physically connected interfaces, including serial and fast Ethernet. So, let's change it around a bit and look at segment B first. Now on this one, the router ID is 10.1.1.3, it's manually set, and the priority of this interface coming out here is 255. So if there are no other high priorities, R3 is automatically going to become the DR for segment B. Now, there's no option for that, so we need to work out which one's going to become the BDR. Now, the router ID is 10.1.1.4 on this one, and the router ID for this one is 172.16.1.5, so R5 is going to become the BDR for segment B. Now, let's work out what the DR is for segment A. Now, the priority is 1 on this, so it's all based on the router ID. However, on R1, there is a priority of 128. So R1 is definitely going to become the DR for segment A. Now, what's going to become the BDR? Well, the address on this one is 172.16.1.3. That is higher than 10.1.1.3. So based on this, R2 is going to become the BDR for segment A. Last question, nearly done. So, all the priorities are set to 1, so it's all, again, based on router IDs and how they're determined by interfaces or if they're manually set. Again, so it's just basically a reiteration of the previous one, almost. Let's do segment B again, just for fun. Now, the router ID is manually set on this. So the router ID for R3 is 10.1.1.3. The ID is 10.1.1.4 on this one, and 10.1.1.5 on R5. They all have a static priority. So, except R4, but it's 1 anyway, because remember, the default priority is 1. On R3, it has the lowest priority out of all those, so R5 will become the DR for segment B, and R4 will become the BDR for segment B. Now, we just need to determine the DR and BDR for this segment over here. Now, the highest one is R3 out of all of these. So based on that, we can automatically determine that R3 is going to become the DR for segment A. That's not there. Now, what is the BDR out of these two? 10.1.1.2 or 10.1.1.1? Well, easy cakes. We can tell based on this that it is going to be R2 because it has the second highest router ID. So R2 is the BDR for segment A. And we're done. There we go, 10 out of 10. We got all of them right, and I hope you learned something.